All right, folk, if I can ask you to find your seats. Thank you so much for getting here on time. Mr. Sipsma, asseblief. I trust that you had a good lunch and that I think that's one of the good things about conferences. We get fed well and you eat far too much. But we've got a treat for you this afternoon, I hope. And I'm sitting looking at a picture of Matladi Ndlovu. She's sitting in Brussels. And she's going to be Skyping into us from Brussels. I got to hear of Matladi through another friend of mine who is going to be one of the speakers a little bit later on. And as I shared the vision of the conference and some of the questions I had, especially when it comes to the physiological things, you know, the simple question, is a child born gay? I was not able to answer. And Alexander pointed me to Matladi. Matladi is a proudly South African, which is just wonderful. I'm going to show you all to her now, and we're going to give her a good cheer. She isn't from Lesotho. It does mention that she's from Lesotho, but she was schooled in Lesotho. I'm not going to mention all her accomplices, but my heart was so warm when I read about Matladi, and as I've connected with her over the last couple of months. This is a busy lady, this one. She's difficult to get hold of, and there you can see her now. We can all see you now, so be careful. Okay. But she's been just so willing to come and share a little bit of her expertise and what she does. And as I said, my heart was just so warm when I realized she was from South Africa. So I'm going to show Matladi the people that you actually know that you're speaking to first, and then I'm going to pray for you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, give a big wave.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Hello.
Now I've got to make sure that she can see the screen. So we're going to control her presentation from the back onto the screens and intersperse it between her voice. Let's close our eyes. Just bless her all the way across to Brussels. Father, we just want to thank you so much for the technology that can enable us to do this afternoon. And I pray, Lord, that the technology will work. And Lord, as Matladi sits in that room about to give her presentation, Lord, give her a real sense of peace. May that come over her. May she have clarity of mind as she does her presentation with us. And Lord, may your spirit just fill her with the words you want to share. Thank you for her, Lord. Thank you that for me, she's proudly South African, and she's just amazing in what she does around the world and for the work that she does. But just bless her this afternoon, Lord. We look forward to this time together. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
God bless you.
Amen.
Thank you, Matladi.
Thank you very much, Sean. Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure, even though I wish I could be there as well, sitting with all of you, and I hope in the next one, maybe this will be possible. So first, thank you, Sean, for inviting me again to this meeting. And I think what you will see immediately is a little bit about my background. And I have the first slide as a disclaimer, and which is probably something that in the field is probably very common to me, but it's very important. So the first slide, what you're seeing here is just giving you a little bit of insights into what I'll be talking about. And I think what is critical here is that I'll try to focus on the genetic and epigenetic factors which are involved in sex differences. I've tried to really somehow condense it, but also leaving it very clear. And also, I think it's an opportunity for us to learn about this together. So the next slide is really an important one for these types of talks for two reasons. So basically, the information I'll be presenting is based on the latest research in this field. And it's in no way based on the work I'm doing for the company. And it's always important for us to do that, that I'm not representing my company in this. Secondly, it's based on my previous work in epigenetics, and also working in labs that have actually looked into embryo development and epigenetic development or influence on that. What I'll start really briefly to do is introduce everybody to epigenetics, because I know it's probably something that is not a common terminology. The structure that I will take is broadly introduce you to the building blocks of life. And most of you know that about DNA. You've probably heard about DNA. So DNA really forms the core of everything about us. It's kind of a code that allows us to be who we are, that we get from our mothers, we get from our fathers, and it allows us to either have our father's eyes, mother's hair, father's nose, etc. So this is all encoded in DNA. And in order for this to happen, you have certain chemicals that help it, and these are called epigenetics. This is really broadly. I think one illustration that I like is about a book. You have letters. Until these letters are put together in a sentence and in a paragraph, you don't have a book. So I would say you could look at DNA as letters that are present. They are there, and you need certain processes to put them in a nice sentence, to put them in a paragraph, and then you can read them. So this is what we'll be talking about. And I think what I wanted to capture is that this is all that is involved in sexual development, or biological sex, as we put it. Three things I want to differentiate of before we even start with the slides is that there's an aspect which is called biological sex. There's also social, somehow social gender, and there's sexual orientation. So for the purposes of this talk, I'll confine myself to the biological sex, how that is defined. We know that it impacts the social gender a lot of times, and you will see a little bit what has been done in the past by those who are treating these patients from birth, for instance. Okay, so maybe we can go to the next slide. I thought I'll start with a story. Most of us know when somebody's pregnant, during their pregnancy, during the 9 months, we're all curious, what is it? Is it a boy? Is it a girl? As soon as the baby is born, that's the first question everybody's asking. Is it a boy? Is it a girl? In buying clothes, in preparation, this is always a key aspect of, is it a boy, is it a girl? And this is somehow to be determining their sex, so their biological sex, which will impact, of course, their social gender, how they're treated professionally, etc., etc. And I guess the question that we're trying to address here is this physical genital expression of the genes enough? Is this it? The fact that somebody will grow up having either, when they know, okay, this person has a penis, so this is a boy, or this one has a vagina, this is a girl. Is that it? Is this what determines what sex is? And I hope that I'm going to take you on a journey through our time together to really see how, what the medical profession has been discovering over the years, how that has been treated, and what we're really finding. So back to that slide, the first slide of the baby. Is it a baby or not? Is it a boy or a girl? At the bottom, I have this line that says, we know for a fact that it's not always easy to actually say whether this is going to be a girl or boy. And what you see there is that 4 in 6 of 1,000 births, it's sometimes not clear whether it's a boy or a girl. And sometimes, and now with really advanced prenatal tests, this can already be seen during pregnancy, and we know that some parents can even decide to abort if it's not very clear. We also know of the Down syndrome, that at certain ages you have all that, and people can also decide to abort. So all to say, it seems very easy, it seems very simple. Well, they have this genital, it must be a boy, it must be a girl, but there are lots of cases where this is not obvious. In the next slide, I've just given you a few examples of such cases. So sometimes we have early testosterone in a girl, and this actually changes through the lifetime of the girl, whereby physically it appears as a girl, but they have some type of scrotum, and they have both a uterus and penis. And sometimes you have testes in a girl, so there's no uterus, there's scrotum, there's penis. Sometimes you have no testes at all in a boy. So why would we call it a boy? I hope you're already wondering that, and I hope to address that. And sometimes there's actually no, so the gonads are the actual physical organ, so either the testes or the penis in a boy or a girl. And sometimes you don't have this, and you have just either, some type of marking on the body, and internally and externally. So medically, people differentiate between what is observed externally versus what is internally, something that formed and didn't manage to come through. And then you also have ovotestes, so where you have both the vagina, the uterus, the penis, and the scrotum. So these are some of the examples that have been observed, and there has been lots of terminologies in the past that were given, and maybe some of you have heard of those terminologies. I decided not to include them because I mean, since 2005, there was an agreement, a consensus among those who in the profession, including endocrinologists, urologists, etc., and geneticists, of course, involved in this, who have really come to define all these disorders as disorders of sexual development. In the past, I think some of you may be heard of hermaphrodites, androgen insensitivity, pseudo-hermaphrodites, and so this has been said, really, they're not exactly true, because it's not like they have both visually, externally, but it's just that you have some type of developmental process, impaired function that happened. So this was just to highlight a little bit that sometimes when we see a child, everything is not as it is. Sometimes, in fact, as you will see with some of the examples, at birth it may appear to be a normal girl, but during puberty, you realize suddenly this girl cannot go through menstruation. And then when they do tests, they actually find that actually maybe it's not really a girl. So I leave it at that, and hopefully we'll come back to that. So if we go to the next slide, here I'm asking the question now, what actually determines sexual identity? And this is where I hope to introduce you briefly to my field, and some of you probably in the audience. So in humans, we know for a fact that sex is determined at a chromosomal level. I just mentioned to you about DNA. And so DNA is part of, as I said, it's really these letters which form a sentence, which then form a paragraph. And if you think of it like that, they are really the engine, and you really need some kind of oil to get it started to really give fuel. So in that sense, they are condensed in the cells, and we have and in the condensation, they come up to what we call chromosomes. I'm going to show you a little bit about what chromosomes are, but I actually forgot to ask. I'm sure all of you have heard of chromosomes or of DNA, right? Sean, I don't know if everybody's nodding that yes, they've heard of DNA at some level. So
I think
basically,
can I just interrupt you there? They are waving to say yes. Can I ask you to switch the Wi-Fi's off, just so we can get a better connection, those of you connected? So I think most of them have heard of DNA and chromosomes. So if they don't, we'll explain it to them afterwards.
Perfect. So basically, there's different ways we determine sex, and because a lot of the DNA that determines the actual organ is in chromosomes, we have what we call chromosomal sex. And this is really determined, as you see in the next slide, at fertilization. So we know that our cells are constantly dividing to give us energy, to take care of any toxins. We are exposed to everything as we're walking. But during development, you see that you have, from your mother, you have 2 X chromosomes. From the father on the right, you have an X and a Y. Now, these then come together. So one is in the egg, one is in the sperm. This is during fertilization. And voila, you get either XX, which is a girl, or XY, which is a boy. And you have 2 examples there. So this is a classical way that we think, this is how we call chromosomal sex, and we determine it at fertilization. I'm going to show you a little bit when this happens. It happens really early on, and I'm also going to show you what influences it and what can make it go wrong, such that you have probably XX or XY, but it doesn't turn out to be what it has to be. So, which is what we call phenotypic sex. And the next one is going to be about the actual organ, that the organ doesn't develop to be what it's supposed to be, and that's gonad sex. Okay, so we go to the next slide. On the next slide, what you're seeing here is basically the basic building blocks of life. So where the entire genome, everything about us, is kept in the chromosomes. We all know that we have 46 chromosomes. And what you see here is that of those, you have the 2 that are sex chromosomes. Those who are women in the audience, we all have XX. Those who are male, will have XY. This is what we think. On the right-hand side, I'm highlighting just what happens. So you have the genetic sex, you have at the chromosomal level, and then you have the gonad. So the gonad is the organ that results. That's your ovary, that's your testis. So this is important to keep in mind as we go through, so that you can see at different levels. What I'm going to show you is that influences during development impact the sex of the baby at different levels. So they impact them either at the chromosomal level, they impact them also at the actual gonad or tissue development level. And this impacts how they express themselves later on. Okay, if we go to the next slide. This slide is introducing you to a little bit of epigenetics. So chromosomes, you've just seen, we have, all of us, we have 46, and XX for most females, XY for most males. In that, what you're seeing is that chromosomes are made up of DNA. So it's really DNA that is tightly rolled. You see here, forming this fiber, which ends up looking like this. So what you're seeing on the chromatin fiber is really compacting. There's a saying that if you can unwind DNA from the cells, you can actually literally stretch it all the way to the moon. That's how long it is, but it's so tightly compacted by what we call nucleosomes. And these are histones. So these are just proteins and DNA. So this is the actual genetic material. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but it's important to know that in order to compact our DNA into the cells and forming chromosomes, it involves proteins, it involves DNA, and they're all tightly wrapped, really tightly wrapped. What makes them so tightly wrapped are the chemicals. And these chemicals is what we call epigenetics. It's something on top of the genes that is modifying how they work. Now, these chemicals on top of the genes are influenced by the environment. They're influenced by what we eat, influenced by maybe medication we're taking, and they impact a lot of the genes. If you go to the next slide, I've just made a summary. So this is just a summary of how epigenetic mechanisms can be influenced. So there you will see that I think on the right-hand side, you see that the health endpoints. So you have cancer, you have autoimmune diseases, you have mental disorders, you have diabetes, all are influenced by these epigenetic mechanisms. So they are influenced by the environment, they're influenced by development, aging, what we eat. All influence these chemicals that really bind the DNA and wind it up into a chromosome. So if you want genes to be expressed, you need to open and you need some other chemicals. If you don't want a gene to be expressed, you close. This is important to understand because when you have two X chromosomes, you can imagine you have the exact same genes coming from your mother and coming from your father. So what the body usually does is that it silences some of those genes and expresses some. That's why you have genes, for instance, your nose looking like your father, your eyes looking like your mother, the hair looking like that, because they close some parts, open some parts. And all these are epigenetic modifications. Okay, we move along. So another point I want to highlight on the basic building blocks, so on the chromosomes, is that on the chromosomes are sitting DNA and these are genes. And sometimes they kind of mix during, there's an abnormality that happens where they mix together. And this we will also see a little bit later what the impact looks like. The first example is the next slide. And this is an example of a gene called the sex determining region, or SRY. This gene is only found on the Y chromosome, and specifically on the short arm of the chromosome. So this gene is definitely associated with sex determination. A lot of experiments have been done in mouse embryos, because with mouse we can really follow them through development. And it has been shown that even if it was an XX, as soon as you add this gene, the embryo turns into a male. So if you go to the next slide, you see that this gene also is being shown to say it has this testis determining factor. So a mutation, which means if something happens on the gene, or it won't be expressed, or somehow it's lost or it's missing, if that happens, then this occurs, this results in the absence of what we call the Y chromosome. So sometimes you will have the XY chromosome, but in female, so they won't have testes. So it's a female in terms of the body, everything that is presented, but from a chromosome or from a genetic perspective, they're males because it's XY. It's just that the SR gene is mutated or missing, and therefore they do not have testes forming. And sometimes it can be present in an X chromosome, so in an XX, who genetically should be a female, but this results in what we call an XX male. Yeah, so just to really highlight, and there's been quite a number of tests that have been shown, and also in a lot of sex reversals from childhood as well, where they've really seen the importance of the SRY gene, so the sex determining region, and that it is really involved in testis formation. So summarizing this, the presence of this sex determining R gene leads to testis formation. The absence leads to ovary formation. All this, what is critical is also that all this happens during the first weeks of the first 6 weeks, 7 weeks of gestation period. This is when you have what we call the gonadal ridge forming. This is when the germ cells are happening. And this is when you can either differentiate to male or female. Okay. The last slide just says ovarian differentiation, we will need 2 X chromosomes. But sometimes we have also a missing X. So we have what we call an XO female, and the syndrome is called Turner syndrome. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So what is important now, which I'll summarize in the next slide, is that we have our X chromosomes that are that are involved in determining the actual sex of the baby by determining or influencing the tissue development, so the organ development, whether this person will develop ovaries, whether they'll develop a vagina, or whether they'll develop testes and a penis. And so this then determines that they are male. What is also important is that these hormones that are involved also involve the brain. And I had the first draft of this presentation had everything, where I was trying to show different levels, that you have sex genes in the brain, which are prenatal, and they're activated during puberty. And so this is where you start seeing certain differences. But I think to really keep it simple, and for the purposes of the talk, for me, which is for us to remember that sexual development biologically or from a tissue perspective is really complex and involving a lot of processes. And sometimes what we see, which is the phenotype sex, is not necessarily what is going on inside the body. And this is the real key thing I'd like to highlight with these processes. Okay, going back to the mechanisms, the slide we just had. Okay, on the right-hand side, this is a very important slide. I know it's very complex, but I felt it's very important to highlight that you have a lot of genes that are involved in determining sex. And there's a cascade of signals that help to the formation of the testes or the formation of the ovaries. And every step is very important. So I will start at the top. You see the green part, and that's your undifferentiated gonadal. So that's what we call the gonadal ridge. And then you move to the right side, because we've talked a lot about SRY. So this is the sex determining region on the Y chromosome. About it a lot. I mentioned to you, can you hear me? Hello? Can you still hear me? We go back to that slide. The SRY, the sex determining region on the Y chromosome, which is the SRY, we see it on the right hand side. So that I've just told you how important it is in terms of testis formation. However, it's not on its own, right? What you see that it has to act on another gene called the SOX9 gene. So this SOX9 gene is actually what will trigger the testis formation by inhibiting or expressing this anti-Müllerian hormone, so the AMH, sorry, what you see there. So just if you see that line, SRY, SOX9, AMH, if you see that, so those are the 3 key steps that are needed in order for the testis development to go properly. Anything at that level could go wrong. So you need 2 copies of the SOX9, and the SOX9 is also influencing other genes which are on the right, which I won't go into, but it's either a mutation at any of these stages is important for the development of the organ be it the testes and or the ovary. And if you move to the left, you see what we call the Wnt4. I'm just leaning into the screen. So of the same figure that you had just now, if you move to the left of genital ridge, you see the yellowish peds. Can you please put the slide back on? Okay, yes. So that if you move to the left of this long mechanism that you see there, so you have on the right, we're just talking about the SRY with the blue. On the left, you have something gold. On the left-hand side is about the ovary development. And there we have another gene called the WNT4. We call it Wnt4. This is very, very important for the ovary to act as an ovary. And you can see there that there's a process of inhibiting SOX9. I won't go into the details. What I wanted to emphasize is that sometimes everything goes well, but then you have a lot of the WNT4. As a result of that, it turns off completely the androgen, and there's no sensitivity, and there's no, it inactivates somehow the ovary. So the two key messages from this slide is that there are 3 levels where something can go wrong. And in every level, there's a number of genes that are involved. I didn't even mention at the top. You see there at the top, you have the NR5A1. That's another critical one. But I just wanted to highlight that at every step of sexual development, it's tightly regulated. There's a number of genes involved. It also depends on the number of copies of genes that are involved. Is it 2 copies? Is it 1 copy? And if you, at one level, you have only 1 copy or 2 copies, that's going to impact whether this is even a fertile female, a fertile male, how it's presenting. Is it presenting as a male and yet the body is actually female because it didn't finish and it's not responding to any male signals? All that is really in that process. Okay, so we go to the next one. This is summarizing everything I've just said, which is in humans, sex is determined in different ways. The first one is chromosomal sex, which is determined at fertilization. And when a child is born and there's an issue, there's a karyotype being done or genetic tests that are being done. The second level is the gonadal sex, which is based on the tissue. Does this kid have a testes and or ovaries? Sometimes certain conditions are not even known until much later on when people are in puberty, or even when they try to have a baby and then there's infertility, then you start finding other things. The third level is phenotypic sex. So whether the genitalia, so the organs, are they externally visible or are they just internally? So females, as you said, they generally have XX and not a Y chromosome, and they will have a characteristic behavior. This is just to remind you that there's certain genes are also working on the brain. So there's sex differentiation in the brain as well, prenatally, which is important for later on in terms of behavior. Males also generally have XY chromosome and characteristic behavior. And sometimes, depending on what is the level where the mutation was or where something happened during development, then this can impact the behavior, even if they correct it. They correct the phenotypic sex, as in when the babies, there's abnormalities in genitalia, they can do surgery immediately, and yet maybe what the behavior is going to be later on different during puberty. And the last thing I think I wanted to highlight is that these sexual differences begin in the very 7th week of gestation. They're influenced by the genetics, by the genes. I've just highlighted a number of examples. I didn't even go through all of them. They are influenced by the hormones, so which are being excreted at this moment, environment. They are influenced by the chemicals which are opening and closing the whole chromosomal structure, and the environmental factors. Environmental factors is twofold. This means the conditions within the cells and or in the placenta. If we move to the next slide, I'm highlighting here that sometimes we're finding it a lot now that what happens during pregnancy is critical for the development of the baby in every aspect of their lives. And I'm going to show later on that it also depends where this injury or this impact happened during gestation. So what you see here is whether the mother is exercising, the mother is under stress, the mother is taking medication, some type of toxins like alcohol, smoking, radiation, traveling a lot, the age of the mother, the genetics, are there infections, their individual microbiome, the nutrients, the nutrient ratio, their body, their BMI. Everything is critical for the development of the baby, and it will depend on what level. Some of the studies that previously we've worked on have shown, especially here in the Netherlands, during World War II, for instance, there was a region where they couldn't come with the food rations. And so some of the pregnant women, they were going through a very critical time of gestation, which you'll see in a minute, which is week 8 to 12. And when that happens, is that they prime their genes such that later on, all those kids who are born from these parents in the Netherlands have developed type 2 diabetes and all disorders that are involved with metabolism. And we can then link them back to the impact of the mother during that period of gestation. So all this to say, there's a lot of other factors determining actually what the sex is. If you go to the next slide, it's an interesting slide, as I know it's also quite busy, but the key thing from this slide really is the fact that you have it's showing you what's going on during different periods of development. So you have your week 1, week 2, where there's dividing of the cells, and then you have the implantation when there's fertilization, and then you have the age of the embryo in weeks. What is important, and which is highlighted in red, are these highly sensitive periods where teratogens may induce major anomalies. So everything I've shown you in the previous slide about what the mother is eating, doing, etc., during those first 8 weeks is very important. And you see that by week 8, this is when you have your external genitalia coming out. So that action starts during around week 7. We know that from week 3 to week 6, it's almost the same. There's no differentiation in terms of the gonads or gonadial. So this is the bigonadial period. And so everything in terms of the genes involved, in terms of the environment that will impact how the baby develops, starts at week 7 to week 8, and then goes to full term. What I also want to emphasize is that, as I mentioned, during the development at puberty, this is another trigger hormonally that triggers how the child actually develops. So if we go to the next slide. My slides. So the next slide actually summarizes this nicely, what I've just shown you, which is that in early embryo, you have the 2 systems. So you have the Wolffian and the Mullerian. I had actually a picture later on, which I'll show you, to show you this is what you see between weeks 3 and 6. And then at week 7, they start to diverge. One develops into the male, so that's the Wolffian, and it will develop into the testes and the penis, and the other one Mullerian, and which means all the epigenetic mechanisms must shut off the Mullerian if it's going to be a boy, or it must shut off the Wolffian if it's going to be a female. So if you have undifferentiated gonads, this is where I think the sex of the embryo is really also determined if there's any issues with that process that divides into either the Wolffian or the Mullerian. If we go to the next slide. So this is what we've been talking about. These were experiments done, I think, early 30s. I mean, it's for us, it's quite beautiful because they've also been shown in mice properly, and you follow them over time, how this really happens. And they really can show week by week how the changes are happening, whereby you really see that then one goes to develop the ovary, and one goes to develop the testes, so the Mullerian and the Wolffian. And I've just taken a few slides going forward to highlight that a little bit. If you go to the next slide, is just showing that a little bit better. You see that the appearance of uncommitted duct system, this is at week 7, which we've seen already. And then if the Y chromosome is present, this will be testes. If the Y chromosome is absent, it will lead to the ovaries and to the full development of the either the woman or the man. So the penis and the testes and the ovaries. So this is internal, external. That's what we mean. So internally, you have your uterus, your ovaries functioning. Externally, you have the vagina, and internally, the penis, the testes, and then the penis. So the next one also shows it in a slightly different way, where you have the physical structures. So we were seeing internally in the first slide, and now you're seeing externally what's going on. So what the structures will look like. And so what a lot of the physicians are seeing at 10 weeks, they know exactly, and then at birth or approaching birth, it's becoming clear. However, as I've said, with all these steps, there's a lot of genes that are involved, number of copies, are they mutated, where are they sitting? If anything goes wrong at birth, that presentation may be mixed. It may still come across as male or female, but genetically it could be something else. And we'll now go to the next slide to look into that a little bit more. So genes on the Y chromosome, so they then, they cause, as I've mentioned, and summarizing this, the gonad to develop as a testes. We've talked about the sex determining region, the SRY gene, how important that is. We've also talked about other genes, which I've shown you in the previous slides, how important they play, how they play important roles, such as the SOX9 in the development of the testes. And once these testes develop, they also secrete 2 hormones, and those are the testosterones. And that's also something else. If they are not able to develop those testosterone, that's another issue. The second slide just summarizes the female development in the absence of the Y chromosome. So we know that when there's no Y chromosome, the embryonic gonads will develop into ovaries. Testosterone will not be produced. Wolffian system will degenerate. The Mullerian is not produced. The duct system develops to the oviduct, uterus, and parts of the vagina. So the sexual phenotype develops, and we know that the hormones are very important in that. So the next slide is just summarizing to you the intricacies and all that can go wrong or has been shown to go wrong in these cases. So you see that it's summarizing a little bit better on the left. You have sperm with Y, we've just talked about that, embryo with XY sex chromosome. You have the SRY, the testes secreting masculinizing hormones in the presence of testicular hormones. So you have undifferentiated reproductive tract, and external genitalia develop along main lines. So this is normal. But the reason I put this in a picture after we've just had it in words is that these are the levels at which sex is being determined. And if anything goes wrong at this level, be it at the sex chromosome level with the translocation, which I'll show you later, where you don't have the SRY gene, for instance, then something will go wrong. be it at the gonadal sac, so even at the time, at the fact of the tissue development, and where you are not supposed to have any SRY gene, which will influence your masculinizing or masculinization of the female, and where it influences the undifferentiated gonads to develop into ovaries. If the levels are not enough, or the genes that are there, or the chemicals are not enough, this will influence whether the other hormones like androgens will be secreted and what develops later on. Okay. So the last slide, I think, is just summarizing this structure again. I thought it would be really good to repeat it and make you familiar with this is the key, really critical period, weeks 7 to 12, when you have this genetia differentiation going to females and males. And the next slide just highlights again the different levels of how it could work. So, and the different genes that are involved. And here I've already started to introduce you a little bit to some of the diseases that could be involved. So what we're seeing here is that on the right-hand side, you do not have the androgen, so this androgen hormone produced. As a result, you have what we call congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So this means that you have someone who will have XX, however, they are not responding at all to androgen. So somehow they might look somewhat masculine or behave a bit masculine. You also have what you have at the bottom, which is a partial androgen insensitivity. So this is also something that is rather common as well, and there's different levels of androgen insensitivity. It could be partial, it could be complete. In the places where it's complete androgen insensitivity, the person is totally feminine, including breast development, etc. But actually, genetically, they have it's just that there's a problem. They have a testosterone, as you can see, that they developed a little bit more like a man, and they will see during puberty, etc., that something is wrong. If you go to the next slide. I don't know if I see, yes, I see what it is. So in this one, it's again highlighting the 3 aspects. I think it's important to highlight these 3 aspects that are being influenced. And these are that the fact that you have the female external genitalia, you have the brain feminization. I highlighted, I won't go too much into that. And then you have the Mullerian duct development. So this is internally. And on the male side, you have the same thing, the Wolffian duct development, the brain masculinization, and the male external genitalia. If you click on that, if introducing epigenetic processes, which I'm not going to go into, but I felt it's important, again, to emphasize how intricate these processes are working together. So some of these chemicals, we call them methylation. So when you see DNA methylation, or we call them acetylation, all these, if it's acetylation, it will have a role on whether it's expressed or not. If it's methylation, it will have a role on whether it's expressed or not. And for those who have heard of, sometimes pregnant women are advised to take folic acid, and this is because folic acid will help in the methyl production, which will be very good for the baby. So it's just about thinking about what you eat really impacts these chemicals which are involved in the gene development and whether the baby will develop properly sexually and their brain function as well. So I think we've highlighted how everything goes. So I'm going to quickly go through what can go wrong. The next slide just summarizes things that I've already said verbally, but now you see it pictorially, which shows you what can go wrong. What can go wrong is that you have 1X instead of 2XX. You have, so this, when you don't have an X, by the way, you can see that that is invaluable. So this will be immediately aborted by the body, because there's a lot of genes on the X chromosome, as you can imagine. So you can also have XXY. This is where you have an extra, just the SRY gene, or you have a triple X female. So you have a bit more chromosomes there. On the right-hand side, you have this, the male, yeah, I think it's the same as well, the Klinefelter syndrome. So here are a little bit of what that looks like. If you go to the next slide, so explaining some of these most common disorders of sexual development and the characteristics that are associated. So here I just wanted to really briefly bring to light that these are very common. Some of them, for instance, if you look at the androgen insensitivity, etc., this is like 1 in 20,000 births. So you know, the first one, we see male genitalia, but with female secondary sex characteristics. They have penis, scrotum, and testes are small, enlarged breasts, sometimes timid, withdrawn, going to the behavior, and possible learning disabilities. This would be a sterile person, of course, or where there's the Turner syndrome, female with external genitalia, but they lack menstruation or PBK or breast development. And this can really result also in either stunted growth, but they're actually, you know, or other body anomalies. So you have mixed, so abnormal chromosome combinations, which I've highlighted. Some of them being appearance of a normal female, sometimes infertile, occasionally impaired of intelligence. And the XXXY, the bottom one, really, I've looked at several papers, listened to a few talks. I think there hasn't been really a true hermaphrodite that has been shown. What happens during development. Okay, if you go to the next slide. So in the next slide, you're seeing again what are some of the, the effects of some of these sex chromosomes, and what the apparent sex of the individual could be, and how that would have an impact on their characteristics. And you see that either they have 46, 45, 47, even 48 and 49. I mean, and so these are, as it says here, these females are known to exist. Traits, mental retardation seems to increase with X, and this is, we know, also with Down syndrome, which also has an X. Typify that on some of the common ones, it will depend on the extremity of how, the phenotype. Sometimes people don't even know until at a certain time later on in life that something's wrong genetically. What it looks like. If you go to the next two slides, so the first one, somebody who has late onset of congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And as I said, it could be, it's predominantly, even when it's a male, they don't even see it, but it could be that it's a person with XX. Can you still hear me, Sean? Something's happening on my end. So did you say something? Okay. All right. So if you can show just the last two pictures, it's just to show examples of real life cases. For instance, the 17-year-old girl, but you can see it in the face, but it looks a little bit like a man, right? But physically, from a genetic perspective, it is a man, it is a woman. And they've been on treatment to reverse back. So following treatment, it shows that, it regressed and they started looking again like a woman. And next one is about the Turner syndrome. So that with the Turner syndrome, you really see the XO that I show. And what I wanted to highlight here is really that it's 1 in 5,000 live births that this can happen. So not so, these are rare, but they do happen. Briefly for questions, because I realized in terms of time as well, I was ambitious in having too many of the translocations. The next slide is just saying that there's really no easy rule to say, is it a boy or is it a girl? There are a lot of factors that influence sexual development and that lead to disorders of sexual development. And medically, some of these, the social medically acceptable terms sometimes intersex. And so we see that there's 3 big buckets. It's either the prenatal factors, so chromosomes at conception, the gonads development, the hormone, the effects of the brain development, and the physical organ development. Then you have the factors of infancy and childhood that are important, and factors at puberty, which is again hormonal changes at puberty, behavioral responses, and physical changes in sex organs and the body. All this leads to what we then term adult gender identity. Maybe I will pause here because what I had after this was just to show you really other things that are happening, that I've just shown you more straightforward chromosomes, but sometimes chromosomes mix, sometimes go from one chromosome to the next chromosome. Then this is because we have 2 X chromosomes, so most of the time they're mechanisms that are meant to monitor the dose, that you don't have too many genes of that or too many genes of that, so they inactivate, and something can go wrong in that inactivation. And it helps us also know where the maternal X was or the paternal, and I was showing a bit of the cat. And that's sometimes an example of the sexual influence traits, including hair, which I've shown. So those are not so important because I think it was more to highlight the complexities that influence really the sex development. And I see that I did include slide to show you what it used to be called, hermaphrodites, etc. But I want to pause here and allow questions if there are any. And I think if you put it on slide 40, when people are just to reflect again on the fact that sex development processes are complex, that you have the chromosomal, the gonadal, the internal genital sex, external genital sex, the hormonal sex determinants, all that involved in is it a boy or a girl, so simple as we would love to say. Are there any, I don't know, Sean, should I just maybe do one last close and then we ask questions completely? Is that better?
That's fine. I'm happy
Okay.
to ask them if there are any questions now, and then we will get them on the speaker system. There are some questions, and then I'll try and make sure that you hear them, Matladi.
Okay, if there are no questions, I will...
No, there are some. So.
Is there?
Yep, there are.
Hello, Matladi. Thank you, firstly, for the very interesting and informative presentation. You mentioned a couple who were trying for a baby as an example, and they found out when trying to have a baby, that's when they discovered that the ladies' or the woman's sex organs were either underdeveloped or not at all. Now, to what extent does gene mutation actually affect how a person feels about their sexual orientation or their identity?
Did you hear that question, Matladi? Still there? It was your question. It was going fine until you asked the question.
She had to go back and think quickly.
We'll just wait for her to call back. And we do apologize about the air conditioners. We hope to rectify that as soon as we can. I don't know, Lisa, if you can ask the technicians whether the connection is still all right with the Wi-Fi.
She was speaking out. That was a hot topic. And the newer ones come with little windscreen wipers. So.
That's what I need.
What do you miss this?
Hello, Matladi, you there? There we go, are you there? Okay, we're going to put you up now. Sound? Okay, just hold on.
Okay.
There we go.
Maybe she heard you.
All right.
Okay, we're back on.
I did. Perfect. I didn't hear the question at all.
You didn't hear the question at all, so Ian's going to say it again for us.
Okay.
Ian, can I ask you to come here, please? Okay. Anyone else who wants to ask a question, come up to the front. It'll probably be easier on this audio here. More than welcome. Just speak into the computer.
Into the computer. Hello, Matladi.
Hi, Ian.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks again for your informative presentation. My question revolves around a comment that you made during the presentation where you made mention of a couple who, after having tried to have a baby, discovered that the woman's sexual organs were either not developed or underdeveloped.
Yeah.
And so my question is, to what extent does gene mutation affect how a person actually feels at any given stage during their lifetime?
So that's thank you for the question, Ian. I think that will depend on which gene is mutated. If you remember, I showed that there's really different genes that are impacted. And so some of these genes impact directly, mostly just the physical formation, and which will go to the woman, as I said, who then finds out they're infertile. But in terms of behavior, this would be also, if it is impacting also like brain development and or hormonal release. So this will really influence the behavior. I think this is where, in this particular case, I mean, in the case that I presented, I think it was mostly genetically in terms of the genital development, but I'm not sure if actually they've done a test to see from a behavioral, but you do have that. And I think with your question, I can also say something else, which is that it has been found, for instance, that you can have a congenital adrenal hyperplasia female, but someone who's appearing as a female, that means breast development, etc. But from a genetic perspective, they're XY, and that means it just means that their genitalia didn't fully form, and as a result, it could potentially be that it actually doesn't show anything per se. So internally, you could have half ovary, half testes, and therefore that's why it's not really showing. And or they're insensitive at all to, to the androgen. And we have a lot, I think what I've seen also when I was doing this research is that you have a lot of people who are what we call androgen insensitive, and they go from a whole spectrum, from partial all the way to complete. And so their behavior is completely dictated by the hormones or the genes that are being expressed, be it if it's more that it's more female, even though they have a partial male genitalia that didn't fully develop, but they will present as female. And they will feel fully female, actually. And it's normal because that's their constituency from the genetic makeup is mostly female, or is insensitive to any of the male hormones. So certain mutations are making insensitivity, for instance, to testosterone. As a result, then the body develops completely female. And sometimes you can then have to take those types of treatments, a hormonal type of treatment. Sometimes it's easy to change, sometimes it's not easy to change. I don't know if it answered you.
Okay, we're happy, Matladi, thank you. Are there any other questions? Okay, are you still there? No? You just want to say hello to your friend? Yes. Come. Come through. There we go. You can use this one. She'll phone us again. Did someone ask something about the network? Hi, Matladi.
Yes, I'm back. Yeah.
Okay, good. Here's a friend of yours who wants to talk to you.
Okay.
Hi, Matladi, it's Alexander.
Hey, how are
you?
you? I didn't know you're already there.
Yeah, I was
I'm
expecting.
good. How are you?
I was expecting to see you here in person, but this is second.
Oh.
This is second best.
Yeah.
Thank you for your input. Just a question. So, from all that you've said, which was obviously enlightening, but I'm sure for most of us was complex.
I tried to. Oh.
No, I totally understand you try to make it as simple as you can, but we are pastors here, so God have mercy on us. But Matladi, just to ask a question, from all your knowledge and all your research and understanding and what you presented, is there a basis for the homosexual gene? Is there a biological basis for saying that it is determined that a person will become male or female in a male or female body, or have same-sex attraction or not? I know that's a very simple question, and it's a highly complex issue of epigenetics. But just give us your opinion, because the big debate is, I was born this way, there is the gay gene, and I have it, and it's determined, and God made me like this, and I have no choice.
So thanks, Alexandra, for your question. I think what I can say is that there isn't a gene, right? There isn't a gene that is a gay gene, or there isn't. I think what I tried to say is that in 1999 there was a saying that there is a gene for every phenotype, but what we have found is that we don't have that many genes that we can have a gene for every behavior, right? And I think in terms of how people feel per se, whether the people will feel male or female, it's really a combination and a number of things. And what I've tried to show, I think, is that you could have, depending on the levels, it could be that the person is appearing male, and yet because of their developmental, the whole system is mostly female. And so I showed, I think, the last slide where I was saying, where somebody has this, the most common thing we know is this congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which means that the people are not responding to androgen per se, or let's say hyper responding, actually, that's why hyperplasia. And as a result, a female may have masculinity in them as well. So some of these people, or some people who have what we call partial response or sensitivity, could claim, or could say that, I feel a certain way, and there's been treatments that have been given in order to balance the behavior. So children, for instance, who have this congenital adrenal hyperplasia, at a teenage level, the girls have a lot of androgen. So they are more masculine and doing a lot of activities, or really feeling hyper, let's say, more masculine kind of. And they've been given treatments, and sometimes they don't want it because they know it's tapering those hormones. So I think it really depends to what extent that this is. In the readings that I've done, Alexander, what I've found also is that there's a differentiation between physically what people see and or the the hormonal changes that are going versus then their sexual orientation, because I think what you're asking is also something of sexual orientation,
Yes.
which is impacted mostly in brain development. So there are two aspects in the reading that I've done, and it's also behavioral, that is learned. I think it's a very complex question you guys are discussing, because it's either behavioral impacted or it's a choice that people make. So not necessarily even linked to anything on the genetics. So this is something they've also found.
That's important, yeah.
So on the spectrum, I think what I'm discussing here is especially when people are teenagers and children are small, and then they are dealing with behavioral, am I female, am I male, where it wasn't clear when they were born. So there are those who have a problem at birth and a lot of surgery is being done. They're based on what is presenting mainly, and then they grow up maybe thinking they're male, but they're actually female because surgery was induced at an early stage. So that's one. The second bit is that somebody grew up female or male, and then later on at infertility realizes from a genetic perspective, actually, they are one or the other. But they have already been growing up in a certain way, and the actual presentation is either male or female, so that's okay. But the third piece is the behavioral piece, which you're asking, I think. And so that the behavioral piece is something very interesting, and I must say, even in the reading I've done from an epigenetics level, we're still very early in the influence on the brain, how that is being influenced. Because it's influenced, as I've shown, epigenetics is influenced by the environment, the physical environment that somebody actually grows up in, that will also have an impact. So you have, I think simplistically, if I want to simplify it, I can say that with a lot of the disorders of sexual development, they are mostly to characterize and help deal with aspects from an early age, from a teenage age or puberty a little bit. And at the level of sexual orientation, this is really two divergent streams, because sometimes it's not at all. Majority are not at all. They've looked at transgender people who are not necessarily physically anything is wrong.
Yes.
But it's how they feel, and some of the literature also suggests from a psychiatrical or psychological impact that could play a role. So I had a slide there that shows usually they suggest that you need to have your psychologists, your endocrinologists, a whole team in this case.
All right. Appreciate it very much. Thanks.
I don't know
Matladi.
if it's helpful. I try, and I'm sorry. I tried to make it simple just to highlight the intricacies of what is involved.
Thank you.
Thanks,
right,
Matladi.
Alexander.
We've got another question for you. This is Andre.
Hi, Matladi.
Hi, Andrew.
Matladi, you spoke very generally about the effects that the mother's experience during pregnancy might have. Now, in the research I've done, I've heard of something called the estrogen wash, and that when that is affected, it could predispose the child to a brain development that could be affected in terms of their capacity to accept their gender. Have you read stuff around that?
So yeah, that's a very good question, actually, and this is why I said I didn't touch a lot on the brain development, and I did put that out as a disclosure, just so I avoid complexities. But yes, so the level of estrogen is very critical for the development, both of the feminine behavior and then for testosterone on the masculinity behavior. So that impacting also different aspects of the brain. And there's a lot of studies actually that have been done in mouse showing, how it's working on the hypothalamia, etc. So there is a clear link with what the mother is eating or what drugs they're taking. Right. And that's what I highlighted there. Are they taking drugs? What are they taking during pregnancy? But I think the key, Andre, is also during that period that I highlighted, especially for sex-related things, it will be between 7 weeks and 12 weeks. Okay. So during that period, if the mother is under duress or taking different types of treatments, those can have an impact directly, on the development.
Great, thank you. And then another study showed that children, especially boys that were born later in the birth order, and especially where there were multiple children, that there was an increased capacity for them to have same-sex struggles later in life. Have you read anything about that?
Well, not so much as in just boys. I mean, one of the key things that we see is age-related or age impact on X chromosome division. So Down syndrome is one example of that, right? You have more chromosomes. So potentially the likelihood of chromosomal translocation based on age, so tight control is not there anymore in the cells. This is what could lead to having an XX, XY, or this type of behavior. And so potentially that could be it. But I think in terms of the studies, I mean, I think one key thing to say is what we've learned a lot has been through looking at mouse, looking at rats, looking at Drosophila, and from humans, it's really now that, for instance, with some of the genital anomalies, that there's some samples being taken, and when there's real issues, and also now with some of the transgender or sexual changes that people are starting to have samples to really look at, to really give it that final step to say yes. But I think the likelihood is high because you see, as I say, with other disabilities or where you can have Downs with age, and the likelihood increases of chromosal translocation and abnormalities taking place.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Matladi.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, Matladi, you can continue. You've got about 15 minutes left.
All right, perfect.
Okay.
So I'm just going to actually close up. Foot one, it's really the last slide, and if you can go back to slide 41, I don't know if it's possible to see it. It's really answering a little bit of some of the questions that are here or that were highlighted just now. Just to say that you can have a lot of different genes or common genes that are being on and off, and these can then have an impact either from a physical development and or from the sex-specific signals that are induced, by the environmental, pre-programming hormonal or genetic cues, and that can have an impact on the regulations of genes and even in the brain. So my last slide is really about the key takeaways. What I wanted to highlight in this talk, if you go to the next slide, is that with all the factors that are influencing sexual development, I think in the discussions that probably taking place to really understand what does it look like and what does it mean. It's important to know at what age are we dealing with who we're dealing with. The pre-puberty, puberty, post-puberty, and understanding that pre-puberty, there's a lot of prenatal impacts that have taken place. So there's a lot that happened that could influence the behavior, be it from a genetic perspective, be it from the actual physical organ development, and be it from something that came from the maternal environment. The second thing is that at puberty, so there's a really loop of hormonal activity that also triggers the full development, and also this can cascade into other changes physically and behaviorally that will come across. And then you have something that happens a little bit later. So the three segments, I think, is prenatal, pre-puberty, post-puberty, and understanding the people that you're discussing, or even the children or adults. I think it's important to also ascertain and determine when actually this happened, because it could be that there has been real biological system impacted. Sometimes treatment alone could help. Sometimes it's important to understand what else they could do. Or it could be that it's really hormonally driven and or other aspects in the society that has impacted that. And the key takeaway from the genetic part that I wanted to highlight is that it takes just expression of one or two genes, and that can really make a big difference. It can be a point mutation, and that can completely alter the sexual fate and impact, even to an extent, the social fate. So again, coming back to the age issue, I think it's really important when dealing with homosexuality, to bisexuality, to different types of sexuality, to really have an understanding, put in mind the fact that when did this express? When is this person? When did it start? And what does that imply? And how do we deal with it? Because I think that impacts how you then deal with it. And lastly, I just wanted to highlight that every individual with a disorder of sexual development is unique and has to be treated with individual care, just because of all that I've highlighted. There is no one person the same, just like with all of us. And so, and I think I went to different levels of the genetic aspect to really highlight that it can be at different levels. The expressions may be the same, but it's still an individual. And it's important to manage these. I mean, from a disorder of sexual development, it's a patient, but I think they're normal human beings who have this disorder, and therefore it is important to individualize that. And if there's a case that one is dealing with, it's important to have a multidisciplinary looking into it if needed. In the next slide, Sean, I think it just shows that when a baby or even an adult, actually at that matter, comes for presentation either to a urologist, endocrinologist, or pediatrician, they emphasize this as well, that a multidisciplinary team needs to work together to really understand, is it a genetic issue? Is it something, because when it's genetic, of course, it runs in the family, and a lot of the adrenal hyperplasia have something to do with that. But sometimes it has to do with the environment, what the mother was doing during the critical period of gestation, or it has to do, as I highlighted, with either mutations that are there. So all this, I think for me, it again emphasizes two key things. Every individual with a sexual development disorder must be treated as an individual, and where counseling is needed or help is needed, it must be a multidisciplinary team. And the very closing slide is somebody you guys all know very well. And this is our proudly South African Caster Semenya. And I quoted this, what she said. You know her story, how the International Athletics Federation put her through tests because of her body to try and understand, is she a female? She does have high testosterone, as the results have been leaked out. What does that mean? You know, and we don't know exactly, of course, which is for her privacy, of course, in terms of the how the presentation is of genital finally, but we do know that there is, if you remember the different levels, there is an impact on the testosterone levels that are being produced, right? And there's a lot of women that have that to an extent. There's always a shade of, it's not one thing or the other. You see women who have beard, you know, some have more beard than others. There's a lot of that. And I think the quote that I wanted to end with is when she said, once she was unbanned and could participate, she said, God made me the way I am and I accept myself. And I think there's aspects of how much are we willing to accept based on people who are not fully developed the way we would have loved to be developed for whatever reasons, but also recognizing that some is a choice, and some you really, depending where they're at and what is influencing them, but it is a choice that they've made, and then you deal with it slightly differently. I think that is probably it, and I think the last slide is more to thank you for your attention and to again reiterate the fact that this was primarily to bring you a little bit of the genetics behind that influences sexual development. We have not dealt at length on the brain development or even the impact of the mother. The maternal and the placenta are critical. This is part of what I work on, for instance, for medications as well. We know chronic diseases, when you take a medication, this can have an impact on the baby. But so it's really important to always take into account what the mother was doing, when the presentation actually happened, or when this sexual disorder or disorientation happened, and treat the person as an individual. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? There's a big round of applause for you, Matladi.
Thank you.
There are a couple of questions, and I'm going to ask one first myself. We're dealing mostly in the room with school leaders, school principals, and teachers. And we're dealing with children from around about the age of 4, 5, obviously going up to 18. Is there any practical advice you can give to us? Signs that we can look out for, more from a physical point of view, because obviously the emotional and the psychological point of view, we're going to be dealing with that a bit later. But from your side, your experience, is there any practical advice that you can give us?
Wow, that's I think that at the age of 4, so you're dealing with between 4 and
18, so past puberty.
4, okay, past puberty. I think that's a critical age for any, let's say, disorder of sexual development, because as I've highlighted, and I think critical things to look at would be, for instance, the appearance. It's mostly appearance, because at this stage, it could be that there was intervention at birth. A lot of the current recommendations clinically is that they should wait, but previously intervention is at birth if is an issue. As a result, a child will grow up probably as a female, but you see from behavior that they kind of, or they present, the way they're presenting it, they're developing and they're changing, the voice is changing, the physical changes are not matching maybe some of their, their gender or the sexuality as it's prescribed. That could be something. As I mentioned, some of these you cannot fully see because it can be somebody who's totally feminine, and then later on it just comes across that it's just because they are insensitive to some of the hormones. But I think the key one when somebody's growing is that this is what I've seen a lot with a lot of the readings as well, is really about how they were given a particular sexual orientation at birth, which may not necessarily be it. And I think maybe that's something to keep in mind a lot when you're looking at these types of children, and then understanding. And I think to deal with it, for me, I would say it's always kind of key to understand a little bit about their background, and if really it's something that you see as predominant, engaging the parents, really engaging the parents to understand if there was any anomalies at birth, because that could enlighten before really bringing it up to the child, because sometimes children are not even aware that there was this intervention at the beginning. Yeah.
Thank you. There's one more question.
Hi, Matladi. I'm Dr. Eli Rosen. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. How are you doing?
Good. So fantastic. I really enjoyed everything that you just mentioned. But I do think that in your presentation, there was a lot of blurring of lines between disorders of sexual differentiation or intersex traits. And we did mention intersex at the beginning of this conference. So when we talk about disorders of sexual differentiation, I just want everybody to understand that we are talking about what was spoken earlier as intersex. And that sexual orientation is not necessarily linked to body diversity, as we saw in your presentation. So when we actually have conversations about, is homosexuality a genetic thing or an epigenetic thing or a socialization thing, we can understand just looking at biology of one part of a human being that this is a immensely complex situation, which is influenced by many, many different factors. Sorry. So yes, I would like to just make a point that speaking about transgender identity, speaking about homosexuality or sexual orientation is actually a separate topic compared to what you have covered in this section.
I fully agree, and I think I highlighted that there's biological sex, there's social gender, and then you have that. I fully agree with you, and yeah. That's all I can say as well, that I think here we're really talking about sexual development, so disorders of sexual development.
Good. Let's give you another round of applause, Matladi. Thank you.
Thank you.
They're all waving at you. For me, not 100% sure that I understand everything, but you've definitely got my brain working, and perhaps for me it would be a case of going to do the research. And I'm just delighted that you have simplified to a certain extent what obviously is a very complex biological situation. And from all of us, Matladi, I'm just so grateful that we could make this happen. I've got a gift for you, so you just have to come fetch it sometime. I look forward to when you do come home to South Africa, that you do come and pop in. I'd love to meet you. And we just want to bless you in the work that you're doing. I'm sure that it is not always easy to come up with answers, because we've all got different views on it, and even from a biological point of view, it's not easy. So just to commend you and bless you, and may the Lord bless you in Brussels. May the Lord bless you and your family. And we just want to say we love you and we really appreciate it. And I'm grateful that we kind of got the technology fine, and you persisted and you got us back again. I'm going to pray for you once more, if that's okay.
Okay.
Father,
no, that's fine. Can I just say something before?
Yes.
Because I think one last thing I want to say is this, that when I know that I tried to simplify it as much as I can. And I think what is critical to really say is that with diseases as well, they impact, this is something I realized I didn't say, they even also impact how, the development if the mother is sick. So it's something I think that is important for all of us. And I apologize again that I really put a lot of science out there. I tried to make it as simple as possible, but I think the message hopefully went across. And thank you so much for your attention, even by video, which is the first also for me from so far.
thank you, Matladi. We're going to pray for you and bless you. Father, we just say thank you so much for Matladi. Thank you, Lord, for the technology that worked in the end. But Lord, we just want to pray your real blessing on Matladi, Lord, as she goes about what is not always an easy task in the work that she does and the influence that she has, Lord. So won't you bless that influence as she travels around the world and just to share her story and share the work that she does. Thank you for her, Lord. We are so grateful in South Africa, and we're proudly South African because of Matladi. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you, dear. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Love you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Good. I need to take a deep breath after that.